Your choice, huh? I'm the media guy.
Oh, you're the media.
What would you like? I got you an International Herald Tribune. You want that?
Anything in a Western language, which doesn't exist.
What do you got? Financial Times?
Absolutely. That's the only paper that tells the truth.
Did you get the one where they've been debating back and forth?
NRC Handelsblad.
Handelsblad.
Okay, that's the...
The combination is unusual, having a professor of linguistics and a secretary of defense on one platform. I assume that Professor Chomsky's interest in war is as profound as Mr. Bolkestein's interest in the use of language. But what they certainly have in common is their passion for politics. I'm afraid that the two distinguished speakers of tonight have serious differences of opinion. And that is exactly the reason why they have been invited. Most of you will know that Professor Chomsky and Mr. Bolkestein have conducted a fierce and sometimes ferocious debate in NRC Handelsblad. They have been disputing virtually every fact the other mentioned. And I have no illusion that they will agree on the evidence this evening. One of our readers wrote me a letter in despair and said, with a variation on Orwell, how is it possible that two people know so much and agree on so little? What Professor Chomsky calls brainwashing under freedom, or manufacturing consent, is to Mr. Bolkestein obtaining the necessary consensus in a democratic society. The one considers the media basically independent, despite some distortions and shortcomings. The other sees the media as a willing instrument of indoctrination for the ruling classes, the elite. In the latter's view, only limited discussion is allowed, provided the fundamentals of the existing capitalistic system remain intact. Bolkestein basically accepts the democratic capitalistic state. Chomsky thinks and possibly dreams about a different democracy in which the creative talents of the people are better used. I come back to Orwell. He wondered how it is possible that beliefs are so often firmly held, completely without foundation, and often plainly at variance with obvious facts about the world. Possibly this debate will show us how Orwellian our two guests of tonight are. Now some words about the order of the discussion. All parties concerned have, after long and polite negotiations, agreed on a rather strict structure. Each of them starts with an exposition of 25 minutes without interruption. That means interrupting each other. Secondly, they have 5 minutes for reply and rejoinder, again without interruptions. The third exchange is of 7.5 minutes each, with interruptions. And finally, both gentlemen will have 2.5 minutes for their closing remarks, again without interruptions, and I hope much will then be clear to us. In order not to confuse the debate unnecessarily, I would like to ask the public not to interrupt. Your chance will come later. Well, the order of debate resembles a genetic code It is CBBC, which means that Mr. Chomsky is going to start. Mr. Chomsky, may I invite you?
Does that mean I should start?
Yes, please.
Thanks. Don't hesitate to interrupt. Well, this evening's program is scheduled as a debate, which puzzled me all the way through. There are some problems. One problem is that no proposition has been set forth. As I understand debate, people are supposed to advocate something and oppose something. Rather more sensibly, a topic has been proposed for discussion. The topic is manufacture of consent, and I think it's a topic that merits careful thought because it bears directly on fundamental problems about democracy and freedom, and what I'm going to do is talk about the topic. Well, let's begin by being clear about the notion under discussion. The phrase manufacture of consent was coined by the influential American journalist Walter Lippman. Writing in 1921, he described, I'm quoting him now, a revolution in the practice of democracy as the manufacture of consent has become a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. He thinks the revolution is justified. The reason is, I'm quoting, that the common interests very largely elude public opinion entirely and can be managed only by a specialized class whose personal interests reach beyond the locality. The common people, he continued, are a bewildered herd, and they can be at most the interested spectators of action. In short, only an elite can deal with the problems that lie beyond the common understanding, and the revolutionary new techniques of propaganda and mass communications provide the means to ensure that the bewildered herd will not interfere where they don't belong, namely in the public arena. Now, how does Lippman, that's the concept, how does Lippman's specialized class gain the power to manufacture consent for the public policy that they design? Well, the answer is rather simple. Those who control resources and investment decisions and so on have the power to define their special interests as the common interest, and they can influence rather substantially the selection and the actions of the corporate and state and cultural managers who constitute the specialized class. Under these conditions, which are largely satisfied in practice, Lippman's assertions become meaningful and even familiar. In fact, they are a modern version of the dictum of the founding fathers of American democracy that, I'm quoting, the people who own the country ought to govern it, quoting John Jay. The Bolshevik overtones of Lippman's conception are evident. Lippman's specialized class corresponds to the Leninist vanguard of revolutionary intellectuals. His manufacture of consent is their agitprop. The Bolsheviks also regarded the masses as ignorant and incompetent, and they quickly dismantled organs of popular control. They relied upon relatively crude means of manufacture of consent or force when these did not suffice. Now, the phrase manufacture of consent is relatively new, but the concept is old. It takes on different forms as social conditions vary, and it's rather enlightening to see how common a theme it is in modern history. Since the origins of modern democracy in the 17th century England, those who describe themselves as men of best quality have been deeply concerned over the attempts of the ignorant and stupid masses, the bewildered herd, to control their own affairs. One commentator in the 17th century warned that the popular Democrats were arousing the rascal multitude and rabble against their natural rulers, the lords, gentry, ministers, lawyers, rich and peaceable men. They were revealing the mysteries of government to the common people, and thereby making them so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule. The rabble rejected both of the contestants for power in the Civil War. They did not want to be ruled by king or parliament, they said, but by countrymen like ourselves. Their pamphlets explained that it will never be a good world while knights and gentlemen make us laws that are chosen for fear and do but oppress us and do not know the people's swords. And these, in fact, have been quite common themes through modern history since. Walter Lippmann, to go back to him, was writing in a particular social context, which gives meaning to his notions, his thoughts. It was a period of severe domestic repression, Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. That was a harsh attack on labor, on freedom of speech, and democratic politics. The repression was launched in fear that the Bolshevik Revolution, shortly before, would inspire the ignorant and incapable mass of humanity to become masters by virtue of their overwhelming numbers. I'm quoting Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of State, who's expressing the standard fear of democracy. The liberal intellectual community at the time was much impressed with their successful service in Wilson's propaganda campaign to induce a generally pacifist population to join the European war. As they put it, they were proud of having imposed their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority, using such measures as what they called historical engineering, that is, shaping the facts of history so as to serve the needs of state power. It was a task undertaken by a group of eminent historians who formed a national board of historical service. The intellectual class also relayed fabrications about Hun atrocities and other matters that were devised by the British Ministry of Information, which secretly defined its task as to direct the thought of most of the world. The Wilson administration created its own agitprop agency to direct the thought of the population at home. Propaganda and its merits were in the air, along with fear of what was called the mass of humanity. And it was in this context that Lippmann spoke of the revolutionary new methods of manufacture of consent. Sorry, I've been talking all day. Wilson's propaganda agency, first in American history, was the precursor of the far more elaborate program of the Reagan administration to control domestic debate by manipulation and deceit. When this secret and illegal program was finally exposed, high officials of the administration described it as the kind of operation that the military conducts in enemy territory. The terminology is apt. It captures the attitude toward the general public, an enemy that has to be subdued. The corporate world was also much impressed with the new techniques of engineering of consent, the term that was devised by the leading figure of the public relations industry, which underwent a rapid expansion in the post-World War I years, dedicated to the task of controlling the public mind, as executives put it. This huge industry offers its services for engineering consent to government policy, while also, in their words, educating the American people about the economic facts of life to ensure a favorable climate for business. Industry manuals explain, quoting, that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. And, of course, they do so by virtue of their private power. It's unnecessary to add. Now, all of this is taken very seriously. There's been a long and very self-conscious campaign of business to subdue particularly the labor movement by these methods. In 1938, the board of directors of the National Association of Manufacturers described what it called the hazard facing industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses. Unless their thinking is directed, it warned, we are definitely headed for adversity. And great efforts were made to redirect their thinking. By 1954, Daniel Bell, who was then an editor for the leading business magazine Fortune, wrote that it has been industry's prime concern in the post-war years to change the climate of opinion ushered in by the Depression. This so-called free enterprise campaign, he puts free enterprise in quotes, indicating that it's a fraud, which it is. This free enterprise campaign has two essential aims: to re-win the loyalty of the worker, which now goes to the union, and to halt creeping socialism, which means the mildly reformist capitalism of the New Deal. The scale of business public relations, Bell goes on, was staggering through advertising in press and radio, forced training programs for workers, and other means. The effects were seen. They were seen in legislation to constrain union activity, the attack on independent thought that's often mislabeled McCarthyism, and the elimination of any articulate challenge to business domination. Several years earlier, in 1947, a State Department public relations officer remarked that smart public relations has paid off, as it has before and will again. Public opinion is not moving to the right, it has been moved cleverly to the right, while the rest of the world has moved to the left, has admitted labor into government, has passed liberalized legislation. The United States has become anti-social change, anti-economic change, anti-labor. In fact, the situation in Europe was more complex than he indicates, but I can't go into that here. Lippman's thoughts on manufacture of consent have frequently been reiterated a few years later, for example, by the influential moralist and foreign affairs advisor Reinhold Niebuhr, who is much revered by George Kennan, the Kennedy intellectuals, and many others, called the official establishment theologian. He wrote that rationality belongs to the cool observers. That's Lippman's specialized class. Because of the stupidity of the average man, he continued, the cool observers must provide necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications for the stupid masses. Harold Laswell explained in the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms, but formal mechanisms exist by which ordinary people might, in principle, shape their own affairs, and that is a threat that must be averted, as the men of best quality agree. Now, the concept of democracy as rule by consent of the government, of the governed, rule by consent of the governed, it's a familiar phrase, is already narrow. It reduces citizens to the role of passive onlookers who ratify decisions made by others. That's well below the demands of popular Democrats for centuries. But the Western Bolsheviks demand a still narrower interpretation. In place of informed consent, we have manufactured consent, manipulation and deceit to allow full sway to the rulers. There's been extensive study of the service of the ideological institutions to controlling the public mind. I can't really give examples here, but I'll give a few just to illustrate. With regard to the media, which have been extensively studied and play a crucial role, there are by now thousands of pages of careful documentation in print, which you can look at for background evidence, and discussing by the harshest tests that can be imagined, the way they function as instruments for the manipulation of the public in the interests of the state-corporate nexus. It's almost entirely study of the U.S. media, so don't draw conclusions from ignorance. The basic task is to establish certain necessary illusions as the presuppositions of discussion, unchallengeable, even unnoticed, like the air you breathe. One basic doctrine is that the United States is not really an agent in world affairs. Rather, it reacts to the transgressions of others. It adopts a defensive stance, and it pursues benevolent ends, sometimes blundering because of its naivete and ignorance. In other words, we contain and deter them. They do not contain and deter us, irrespective of the facts, which reveal something rather more complex. In the case of official enemies, their repression, terror, and aggression elicit vast indignation. In contrast, our repression, terror, and aggression cannot be perceived, except perhaps as errors. Where massive violence proceeds without affecting U.S. interests, elite U.S. interests, it's largely ignored. My colleague Edward Herman and I have documented a wide range of dramatic cases of these three categories. So to illustrate a few striking examples picked for comparison, because they're similar, the Pol Pot terror aroused vast outrage from the first moment. In contrast, the second category, the Indonesian terror in East Timor, in the same years and on the same scale, was literally suppressed, and it even elicited apologetics. And that's important because since it was crucially backed by the United States and also Holland, it could have been stopped. So on moral grounds, it was quite a significant case. To take an example of the third, which we study, the massacres in Burundi were ignored because they had no relevance to elite U.S. interests. Actually, we also discuss a fourth category, more horrifying perhaps, the category of atrocities that are approved or even sometimes applauded. The Indonesian slaughter in 1965 is a case in point, which we discuss in some detail. There are many others. Coverage of the Indochina wars is one of the most dramatic examples of subordination of the intellectual class to external power. Notice there's massive evidence on that. We easily recognize that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and conducted a brutal war of aggression, and we dismiss with contempt its claim to be defending the legitimate government against terrorists sponsored from abroad. But such perceptions are barred when the United States invades South Vietnam, as it undeniably did in 1962, if not earlier, then extending the aggression to the north and to Laos and Cambodia, virtually destroying Indochina. These thoughts are unthinkable and are rigorously excluded from mainstream reporting and commentary over decades. This is 100% as far as I know. The extreme doves will say that the defense of South Vietnam was unwise, adopting the terminology of any commissar with regard to Afghanistan. This is quite a spectacular achievement of manufacture of consent among the educated classes. Herman and I review it in detail from 1950 to the present in a recent book, if you want some background. In this book, we focus particularly on coverage of the Tet Offensive. We picked that because it's been the main example offered to show that the press is independent of government power, even adversarial. As we show in great detail, reporting of the Tet Offensive remained completely within the framework of U.S. government propaganda. When the U.S. Air Force blasted towns and villages in South Vietnam during the Tet Offensive, the press described the horrors as the defense of South Vietnam against the South Vietnamese, plainly, because, as the Pentagon conceded, there had never been any North Vietnamese troops anywhere near these southern provinces, which had long been subject to the murderous operations of the United States military and its Korean and other mercenaries. The press has been accused of portraying an American military victory as a defeat and as being too pessimistic about the prospects for the American military effort. It's an interesting criticism to begin with. The assumption is that the press must not only depict a U.S. attack against South Vietnam as a defense of the country from indigenous forces, but it must be enthusiastic and optimistic in the service of the state. But putting aside this intriguing perspective, the argument collapses from an elementary logical flaw. We happen to have a detailed record of assessments by the CIA, the military in the field, and the top policymakers and advisors in Washington, who were not relying for their information on the media, naturally. And their assessment turns out to be far more gloomy and alarmist than the media coverage. The reason is that the media were relying on the public statements of the government, not aware of the internal record that was only revealed later. So the description of the media as independent or even adversarial reduces to the claim that although they strictly followed the propaganda doctrines, and although they were more optimistic about the U.S. prospects than U.S. intelligence, military, and policymakers, still they were not enthusiastic enough in their portrayal of an American military victory. At this point, comment becomes superfluous. The standard pattern is also well illustrated by the most controversial issue of the 1980s, namely Central America. There's been lively debate, but within narrow limits, transcended actually only by statistical error. One unquestioned doctrine is that there are 4 democracies in Central America with elected presidents and 1 dictatorship, Nicaragua, that never permitted an election that meets our high standards. The doctrine is a ludicrous falsehood but a necessary illusion, therefore beyond challenge. It's simply presupposed. Across the spectrum, it is agreed that we must support the murderous terror states, El Salvador and Guatemala, and we must restore Nicaragua to the Central American mode and impose upon it regional standards. That's the Washington Post, the more dovish of the two national dailies. When the independent media in El Salvador and Guatemala were physically destroyed by the US-backed security forces, their editors tortured and murdered, their plants wrecked, there was no reaction, no editorial comment, not even news reports, which is an indication of how much freedom of the press means to the Western media. There's no reaction when a liberal journal, the New Republic, explains that we must provide military aid to the terrorist army of El Salvador, quote, regardless of how many are murdered. It's a phrase that recalls the Nazi archives. There's no reaction when government spokesmen inform us that the U.S. mercenary forces are instructed to attack agricultural cooperatives in Nicaragua in the style of Abu Nidal, or when U.S. officials explain calmly that the purpose of the terrorist attack is to compel Nicaragua, quoting, to divert resources to defense and away from social reforms. In fact, how does one react to such a statement? A further unquestioned doctrine is that no country has the right of self-defense against U.S. attack. The doves warn that we will bomb Nicaragua if it attempts to obtain jet interceptors to defend its territory from U.S. flights supplying terrorist forces in the field and providing them with up-to-the-minute military information so that they can safely attack undefended civilian targets in accordance with their instructions. We will know that Gorbachev's new thinking is serious, the doves explain, if he ends his support for Nicaragua so that it will be abandoned to the whims of the master of the hemisphere. It's simply taken for granted that the United States has every right to disregard international law, dismiss the World Court and the United Nations, violate treaties, undermine and dismantle the peace accords in Central America, as it has just done once again, and so on. Now, these doctrines reflect the consensus of the powerful, and therefore lie virtually beyond discussion, as has been extensively documented. There was, however, a tactical disagreement among elites on the means that should be employed to restore Nicaragua to the Central American mode of slaughter and repression, starvation and misery. Should the U.S. rely on terror and torture to reduce Nicaragua to the level of El Salvador and Guatemala, as the Reagan administration demanded, or should it keep to economic and ideological warfare and other measures that should suffice to strangle a tiny country dependent on its relations with the U.S. for survival, as the doves prefer? On this tactical question, the media encouraged debate, reflecting the concerns of domestic privilege. While similar conclusions have been confirmed quite generally, they have evoked no serious challenge, and in fact it should hardly be surprising that the media function in the way that is advocated by established power and even by a major intellectual tradition, as a device for manipulation and marginalization of the annoying public. Well, so far my remarks have been descriptive. I'll make a brief comment on a value judgment concerning the traditional doctrine that elites should resort to manufacture of consent, necessary illusions, historical engineering, and other methods to control the bewildered herd. Notice that the question is not whether the representatives of the people have a right to explain their views to their constituents. That's uncontroversial and has never been at issue. It is not the question discussed by Lippman or anyone else, and it need not be discussed by us. The question is whether privileged elites should dominate mass communication and should use this power as they tell us they must, namely to impose necessary illusions, to manipulate and deceive the stupid majority and remove them from the public arena. The question in brief is whether democracy and freedom are values to be preserved or threats to be avoided. Democracy and freedom are values in themselves, and they need no justification in instrumental terms. Nevertheless, there is today a compelling justification in such terms. Modern industrial civilization has developed within a certain system of convenient myths. The driving force has been individual material gain, which is accepted as legitimate, even praiseworthy, on the grounds that private vices lead to public benefits in the classic formulation. It has long been understood that a society based on such a principle will destroy itself in time. It can only persist with whatever injustice and suffering as long as it is possible to pretend that the destructive forces that humans create are limited, that the world is an infinite resource, and that it has an infinite capacity to absorb waste. The falsity of these assumptions can no longer be obscured. At this stage of history, either the general population will take control of their own destiny and concern themselves with community interests guided by values of solidarity and sympathy and concern for others, or alternatively, there will be no destiny for anyone to control. As long as some specialized class is in a position of authority, it will set policy in the special interest that it serves. But the conditions of survival, not to speak of justice, require rational social planning in the interest of the community as a whole, and by now that means the global community. There is no guarantee that true functioning democracy will realize community interests and values or attend to social costs. Humans may be a biological joke, an evolutionary dead end. But we can be fairly confident that this is the only hope. In this possibly terminal phase of human existence, democracy and freedom are more than values to be treasured. They may well be essential to survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. Mr. Bolkestein, the floor is yours.
past niet in, dus mensen die gaan de zalen uit. Ja?
Let me begin, Chairman, by welcoming Professor Noam Chomsky most heartily to our country and to this city. It is indeed an honor and a privilege for me to engage in a public discussion with him. I hope that he will enjoy the debate as much as I'm sure I shall. Why do we know and understand so little? Why do we know and understand so little, even though the evidence available to us is so rich? That is how Professor Chomsky defines what he calls Orwell's problem. It is a problem that has often baffled me. It is no coincidence that Professor Chomsky and I have run into each other. Why is it that some people refuse to see the evidence that is placed before their eyes? 40 years ago, the lawsuit that Viktor Kravchenko brought against the communist journal Les Lettres Françaises was judged in Paris. Kravchenko was the author of the book I Chose Freedom. Many French intellectuals refused to listen to what Kravchenko had to say. One of them, the writer Roger Vaillant, wrote, "Objectively, historically, Kravchenko is a traitor. Everything he tells us of his country of origin must be suspect." Professor Chomsky calls Paris a cultural backwater. But the French were not the only ones to reject the evidence out of hand. Many intellectuals closed their eyes and ears to the reports that came out of the Soviet Union. Perhaps they knew, but certainly they did not want to know. There is none so blind as he who does not want to see. When Deng Xiaoping visited the United States for the first time, President Reagan invited Shirley MacLaine to his table. The famous actress told the communist leader of her trip to a Chinese village some years before. What she had found so admirable was that professor and peasant worked side by side. At first, they had found life difficult, the professors had said, but by dint of hard work, they had managed to identify with their peasant existence. They lied, was Deng's reply. Certainly, the Shirley MacLaines, the Susan Sontags, and the Mary McCarthys of this world were deceived, but also they wanted to be deceived. Now, why did so many intellectuals take leave of their senses, always searching for a new paradise and saying, I have made up my mind, please don't confuse me with facts? It is a famous question, and it has received many answers. Let me just mention one aspect. The famous Dutch writer Harry Mulisch once wrote, even if Cuban society turns into a police state, it will be our fault, just as it was our fault that the Russian Revolution degenerated into Stalinism. With respect to the Hue massacre in South Vietnam, Mary McCarthy could not accept that the other side might have done it. She said, quote, there is no way of knowing what really happened. I should prefer to think that it was the Americans. Now, why should Miss McCarthy prefer to think that her own country had committed those crimes? These intellectuals are motivated by feelings of guilt. If something goes wrong, it must be our fault. Western civilization is suffused with Christianity, and the guilt complex lies at the heart of that religion. Come fix upon me that accusing eye, I thirst for accusation, the Irish poet William Butler Yeats wrote. The view that many Western intellectuals have of the world is compounded of arrogance and guilt. Certainly, not all good things in the world stem from the West, but neither do all the evil ones. So yes, Professor Chomsky has a point. Orwell's problem does exist. Many Western intellectuals do not like. Propaganda is to democracy as violence is to totalitarianism. Professor Chomsky develops this thesis in a recently published book called Manufacturing Consent. He tries to prove his points by means of case studies. One of these studies compares the media treatment of the murder of Father Jerzy Popieluszko by the Polish police in October 1984 with that given to the murder of 100 religious victims in Latin America between 1964 and 1980. He finds that the murder of the one Polish priest was reported more fully than that of the 100 Latin American religious victims taken together. Professor Chomsky says this shows a bias, and so it does. My point is, however, that there are other examples of bias in the Western press which do not at all have the same thrust as the example given by Professor Chomsky. On 13 September 1977, Steve Biko was murdered by the South African police. A wave of publicity and indignation covered the world. The death of Biko was a contributory factor of the arms embargo which the Security Council of the United Nations instituted against South Africa on 4 November 1977. It was also a contributory cause of the cancellation of the cultural agreement which this country had with South Africa. In the Central African State, Burundi, two different races live side by side. The Tolwa Tutsi hold all power, even though they constitute a mere 15% of the population. The Short Bahutu form the majority, but they are exploited. In 3 periods of violence, these 2 races have engaged in wholesale slaughter of each other, in which the Hutus especially were made to suffer. Reports in the media of these happenings were scarce, except in Belgium, and their political effect was nil. Now, this is an example of bias that does not fit Professor Chomsky's mold. Surely, the American military-industrial complex is part of his elite, if indeed it is not identical with it. Surely, the sale of arms to South Africa is of importance to this military-industrial complex. Could they not have stopped all this news about Steve Biko? Surely, if they hold the American media in the vice that Professor Chomsky describes, that would be all in a day's work. The truth is that things are not as simple as Professor Chomsky maintains. Another of Professor Chomsky's case studies concerns the treatment that Cambodia has received in the Western press. Here he goes badly off the rails. Professor Chomsky claims that during the Pol Pot era, from April 75 through 1978, a, quote, flood of rage and anger was directed against the Khmer Rouge, unquote. If we are to believe him, the publicity was massive, the outrage was overwhelming, and the propaganda campaign was conducted, quote, at a level of deceit of astonishing proportions. This is very far from the truth. Miss Juliet Golden, who is connected with the New York-based Cambodia Information Center, has tallied the numbers of articles, editorials, signed columns, opinions, reviews, and letters in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal for the years of the genocide. She has also analyzed Time, Newsweek, and the Far Eastern Economic Review. She has been just as careful as Professor Chomsky in the case of Father Populusco. And her numbers show that during the years of the genocide, there was no massive publicity, there was no overwhelming outrage, and there was no propaganda campaign. Chairman, I wish there had been, for perhaps then it would have been possible to save some of those people. For the entire 3.5 years of the Pol Pot regime, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal each ran a total of 9 editorials, while only 4 appeared in the Washington Post. Throughout the years of the genocide, coverage of events inside Cambodia was sporadic. In 1976, 1 article appeared in Time. Newsweek did not mention the subject at all. When, towards the end of 1977, the representative of Israel to the United Nations mentioned the Holocaust in Cambodia, he was greeted with deafening silence. In April 1978, the House of Representatives in Washington passed a resolution condemning Cambodia. It merited only a 1-sentence dispatch in the New York Times. Professor Chomsky alleges that the Western elites marginalize critical discussion. Let me turn to the United States itself. In March 1982, the new republic began a campaign against the Environmental Protection Agency. Its head was accused of running down the agency and of using its budget for political ends. In April 1982, CBS devoted a 60 Minutes program to the EPA. In July 1982, Congress held a hearing. In February 1983, the FBI started an investigation, in the course of which 20 employees of the EPA were sacked. One of them was convicted of perjury and condemned to 6 months imprisonment and a fine of $10,000. Perhaps Professor Chomsky considers this a marginal affair. Well, what about Watergate? Does he think that is also small beer? It caused the fall of President Nixon. It also gave rise to a lawsuit in which an attorney general, a White House chief of staff, and 24 others of various ranks were found guilty. And of the 12 members of the jury, chairman of the jury that delivered the judgment, 9 were women and 8 were black. Couldn't the American elite have stuffed a newspaper down deep throats? Chairman, let me go back to international affairs, to Israel. The Israeli incursion of the Lebanon took place during the summer of 1982. How was that war reported? NBC's Jessica Savage said that 600,000 people were left without food as a result. Now, the total number of people in the area where the war took place is 500,000. So there was something wrong there. The source for the number of 600,000 was the International Red Cross. But the Red Cross based itself on information from the Red Crescent, which is headed by Dr. Fatir Arafat, the brother of Yasser. The Red Cross withdrew its earlier estimates. ABC's Barry Dunsmore said, the Lebanese police estimate that 10,000 people may have died in the fighting, without mentioning that this number had also come from the Red Crescent, nor that the police had virtually ceased to exist in the south of Lebanon since the invasion of the PLO. It was clear to anyone who had traveled in the south of the Lebanon that the original figures of 10,000 dead and 600,000 homeless were extreme exaggerations, but they were nevertheless used by both Caspar Weinberger and Francis Pym in interviews given at the time. Chairman, I am at pains to stress that I think the Israeli invasion of the Lebanon was a great mistake. Many Israelis think so too. My point is this. According to Professor Chomsky, quote, the United States is committed to the creation of a powerful and expansionist Israel as a strategic asset. The peace process of Camp David served to remove Egypt from the conflict so that Israel would then be free with massive US support to attack Lebanon, unquote. If that is the way things are, and if the American media are collectively the handmaiden of the American elite, did they not rather fall down on their job when they produced these bits of anti-Israeli disinformation and sent the American Secretary of Defense and the British Foreign Secretary up the garden path? Chairman, may I say in passing that I find it regrettable that a figure of such prominence as Professor Chomsky condemns the one little bit of peace that has occurred in the Middle East. Chairman, of course, the media are influenced by intellectual fashions. Of course, intellectuals like being part of a crowd. At the time of Israel's war in the Lebanon, the fashion was to compare Israel with Nazi Germany. Newsweek drew a parallel between Beirut and the Warsaw Ghetto. Both Time and Newsweek carried the words Israel's Blitz on their covers. Jonathan Randall wrote in the Washington Post that the camps in the Lebanon looked like Dachau and Auschwitz. One wonders how he knew. Professor Chomsky has not escaped this trend. In a book he published in 1983, he described the Israeli youth movement of the 30s, Betar, as a fascist-style movement. Nor indeed has the well-known Dutch columnist Jan Blokker, about whom I wrote 2 years ago in NRC Handelsblad. And lately, Bassam Abu Sharif, Yasser Arafat's media advisor, said in The Hague that he saw no difference between the Palestine detention camps and Auschwitz. So yes, intellectuals like to be trendy, but in which way did this trend benefit Israel or the American elites, which, according to Professor Chomsky, is its paymaster? Chairman, let me now further define my differences with Professor Chomsky. They exist at 3 levels. Let me now further define my differences with Professor Chomsky. They exist at three levels. The lowest level is that of insults. Professor Chomsky seems to believe that the people he criticizes fall into one of two classes, liars or dupes. Consider what happened when I discussed the case of Robert Faurisson. Let me recall the facts. This French former professor of literature wrote that Hitler had never ordered or allowed anyone to be murdered because of his religion or race. He was thereupon suspended from the University of Lyon. Professor Chomsky and a number of other intellectuals signed a petition in which Faurisson is called a respected professor of literature who merely tried to make his findings public. The petition protested against the efforts to deprive Professor Faurisson of his freedom of speech and asked for his just right of academic freedom to be respected. Faurisson then published a book in which he tried to prove that the Nazi gas chambers never existed. The book contains a preface written by Professor Chomsky in which he calls Faurisson a relatively apolitical sort of liberal. In my first article in NRC Handelsblad, I wrote that Professor Chomsky, through his reputation, had provided Faurisson and his editor Pierre Guillaume with an audience which otherwise they would never have had. Indeed, Guillaume himself wrote that their breakthrough was due to the, quote, inestimable support which Chomsky has afforded us, unquote. What is Professor Chomsky's reply to this? He accuses me of having a Nazi mentality, of being a Russian people's commissar. He writes that it is I who am giving Faurisson publicity. In short, I am guilty of tiresome deception, of lies and absurdity, of a pathetic and scandalous performance. Chairman, this is an attempt at intellectual intimidation. These are the ways of the bully. Professor Chomsky uses the oldest debating trick on record. He erects a man of straw and proceeds to hack away at him. But, Chairman, I am not made of straw, nor am I about to be bullied. Chairman, one last word on the Faurisson affair. When Professor Chomsky signed his petition, when he wrote his preface to Faurisson's book, the only point at issue was the suspension of Faurisson from the University of Lyon. Now, Professor Chomsky makes of this a case of civil rights, of freedom of speech, but this is a red herring. There was no more violation of Faurisson's civil rights than would be the dismissal of a biochemist caught faking the results of his experiments. No university tolerates a professor of geography who believes that the earth is flat. Chairman, the second level of my disagreement with Professor Chomsky appertains to the role which the United States play in the world. Since the death of Stalin, Professor Chomsky writes, quote, the balance of terror appears to have shifted to the West and its clients, with the United States setting the pace as sponsor and supplier, unquote. Torture is now, quote, largely a free world phenomenon, unquote, he writes. The United States are therefore responsible for most of the political repression in the world. Let us see how this axiom leads Professor Chomsky astray. Again, Cambodia. Professor Chomsky holds that the American bombing provided the Khmer Rouge with the psychological ingredients of a violent revolution. Against this, I quoted Dith Pran, whose experience is the story of the film The Killing Fields. Dith Pran described Pol Pot's thoughts as a communist radical ideology fed by French ideas and a crazy sort of nationalism. Professor Chomsky is doubtful. Dithpran is not, quote, competent to discuss the peasant society of inner Cambodia, of which urban Cambodians knew virtually nothing. Here, the Massachusetts professor belittles the man who has been through it all. Professor Chomsky continues to maintain that the Khmer Rouge engaged in wholesale slaughter of their fellow citizens because they regarded those other Cambodians as their torturers. In order fully to appreciate how bizarre this statement is, consider, Chairman, the case of the Khams. This Muslim minority had been living in Cambodia since time immemorial. They were twice doomed for their foreign race and for their reactionary faith. The majority of Khams nonetheless joined the Khmer Rouge until 1973, when the communists declared the Khams' distinct lifestyle counter-revolutionary. And as a result, in less than 4 years of Khmer Rouge rule, as many as 1/2 of the Khams were murdered. Now, can Professor Chomsky explain in which way the Khmer Rouge could regard the Khams as their torturers? Chairman, I do not here defend the deeds or misdeeds of the American government. It's not my job to do so. They can quite well do that themselves. The US Marines intervened 20 times in Caribbean countries between 1905 and 1965. It would probably have been much better if they had not done so. But if the Americans had never set foot south of the Rio Grande, would Latin America not have known dictatorship or misery? Certainly it would. And its economic development would have been retarded. If Teddy Roosevelt had not decided to complete the Panama Canal in 1903, Panama would today probably be the same backwards and forsaken province of Colombia as then it was. Professor Chomsky considers his country to be the chief cause of the political and economic underdevelopment of Latin America. That view is ahistorical and therefore shallow. The United States are not the sole actor on the world stage, far from it. Chairman, I now come to the third level of my disagreement with Professor Chomsky. It concerns the proper way of ordering the affairs of a society. In my view, any society needs a coherent set of generally accepted principles if it is to function properly. Certainly, a large and multiracial society like the United States, a nation of immigrants, needs such a coherent set of principles. For a long time, the Protestant ethic performed that role. I am not so sure this is still the case. If I am correct, that is surely a cause for worry. But the need, to my mind, is clear. I do not think Professor Chomsky sees that need. Perhaps he can enlighten us on this score. Within that set of broadly accepted principles, leadership is exercised by creating consensus. Professor Chomsky calls this the manufacture of consent. I call it the creation of consensus. In Holland we call it draagvlak, which means foundation. No democratically elected politician can govern without such a broad consensus. All who are elected strive to bring it about. Professor Chomsky thinks it is deceitful, but it is not. In a representative democracy, it means winning people for one's point of view. But I do not think that Professor Chomsky believes in representative democracy. I think he believes in direct democracy. With Rosa Luxemburg, he longs for the creative, spontaneous, self-correcting force of mass action. That is the vision of the anarchist. It is also a boy's dream.
Thank you, Mr. Bolkestein. One would like to hear what Professor Chomsky is going to reply on this, but the order of the debate is different. The order is that now Mr. Bolkestein replies for another 5 minutes on what Professor Chomsky has said. Do you remember what Professor Chomsky has said?
Chairman, Professor Chomsky tries to establish his thesis by the use of examples. He has posited a theory, and he says, and he tries to prove that theory by way of showing examples. Now, we all know that a theory can never be established merely by examples. It can only be established by showing some internal inherent logic. Professor Chomsky has not done so. He has confined himself to examples, and in order to refute what he says, I again must address myself to the examples he has given. The first example that I will address myself to is the Tet Offensive. Now, let me once recall the facts. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam took place in the first few months of 1968. Despite some initial and stunning successes, this offensive resulted in the defeat of the Viet Cong. And the Vietnamese have recently, for the first time, admitted that the Viet Cong was decimated as a result of the Tet Offensive. After Tet, the Viet Cong were virtually eliminated as a coherent fighting force. And thereafter, the burden of the war in the south fell more and more onto the North Vietnamese army. But the American media portrayed the Tet Offensive as a defeat for the South Vietnamese and their American allies. Professor Chomsky admits himself that the Tet Offensive has convinced much of the corporate elite in America to abandon the war efforts in South Vietnam. He himself admits that it was a turning point in the war. The biased picture which the American media drew of the Tet Offensive was therefore not without political consequences. Tran Bach Dang was the Viet Cong's commander in Saigon during the Tet Offensive. He recently said about Tet, let's put it this way, the political results were higher than we expected. Small wonder. On the 31st of March of 1968, President Johnson announced that he would not run for presidency again. So the facts are quite clear. The Tet Offensive took place in the early months of 1968. They resulted in a defeat for the Viet Cong, which was decimated as a coherent fighting force. The Vietnamese now themselves admit that, yet it was a turning point in the war. As a result, President Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. How can these two facts be reconciled? Quite simply because the picture that was drawn in America of the Viet Cong was erroneous, and of Tet was erroneous. The picture they drew was incorrect. The second example I want to quote concerns Nicaragua. Chairman, how did the American media report on the Sandinista revolution before and immediately after it took place? And how did the American government react to that? Well, now, both the Carter administration and most of the major news media took a relatively hopeful view of the Nicaraguan revolution. In November 1978, Jack Anderson wrote in the Washington Post that left-wing influence on the Sandinistas was minimal. In the same paper, Karen DeYoung wrote as follows of the decrees announced by the new Sandinista government, quote, the laws project the new government as highly moralistic concerned about state security, and politically liberal in a social democratic mold. In August 1979, the New York Times carried an op-ed article by Tad Schultz, which said, "Relax, Nicaragua isn't Cuba." The same month, the LA Times carried a syndicated column by Georgie Ann Gaia, quote, "Is Nicaragua inevitably to become a Cuban-style Marxist revolution?" she asked, and she answered, "Absolutely not." Should the United States, with consideration, support the Nicaraguan revolution? Absolutely yes, unquote. In September 1979, the New York Times ran an editorial that said, "So far, the revolutionary regime has shown its good faith by restoring liberties and pursuing a pluralist path." And in June 1980, the newspaper, which carries all the news that's fit to print, editorialized, "A sharp swerve to the left is always possible, but for the moment there seems a genuine commitment to pluralism at home and non-alignment abroad." And, Chairman, the point is that the financial flows reflected that reporting. Loans, credits, and grants to Nicaragua totaled $4.6 billion for the period from mid-1979 to 1986. President Carter provided $75 million of assistance, of which $60 million were disbursed. Total West European loans, credits, and grants averaged around $120 million annually over that same period. And the biggest West European donor was the Netherlands. Over the 6 years, 1980 to 1986, we gave $113 million in official development assistance. Now, what were the American media doing just before, during, and just after the Sandinista revolution? Were they furthering the interest of the American elite by portraying the Sandinistas as social democrats, full of moderation and committed to pluralism? They were not very successful. If they did, they certainly did not manage to stop those financial flows. Chairman, I want to stay with these two single issues, the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam and the way the American media portrayed the Sandinista revolution. Both examples go counter to the reasoning put forward by Professor Chomsky and disprove his thesis. And since I'm ending the end of my time, I should like to put the following three questions to Professor Chomsky. One, Professor Chomsky writes about feigned dissent, about marginal criticism. Now, what is the litmus test that enables us to distinguish between marginal and real criticism? Two, how come the US media are critical at home, yet subservient abroad? Why do they change their stripes when they cross the US borders? And three, Professor Chomsky wrote in 1979 that, quote, "Washington has become the torture and political murder capital of the world," unquote. That was printed in italics, and it was not about crack. Does he still hold that view?
Thank you very much. Professor Chomsky, may I invite you for your 5 minutes. If you want to ask these questions, it's all right, but if you want to reply on further statements,
glad to answer. You'll notice a difference in the way we approach this topic. I was discussing manufacture of consent, democracy, the possibility of survival. Mr. Bolkestein is discussing my alleged sins. For those of you who don't know the background, this is his fourth try. On each of the earlier occasions, I went through his charges one by one and showed that every one of them was a flat falsehood. Each time he has conceded that fact, silently, abandoning the earlier charges and proposing new ones. He's done it again. Notice that we could concede all of that and it would be irrelevant to the topic. Let's concede that I'm a Nazi, a communist, a child molester, and so on. What does that have to do with the topic of manufacture of consent? Zero. Simply the fact that Mr. Bolkestein talks about the feudal structures and violence in Latin America and says, quote, the gringo has nothing to do with it, namely demonstrating not only the most extraordinary historical ignorance, but apologetics for slaughter of a kind that I know of no analog to. That fact is irrelevant to manufacture of consent, which is why I did not bring up that and numerous other things which are in print. Now, Mr. Bolkestein has tried new charges, and just to show you how he uses evidence, I'll give one. If you like to talk about these things, I'll be glad to do it and respond to them in point, but notice they have nothing to do with the issue. They're an attempt to evade the issue. Just to illustrate how he uses evidence, Mr. Bolkestein claims that I hold that U.S. bombing provided Cambodians with psychological ingredients for revenge against the urban society. As he knows, that is false. It has already been demonstrated to him that it is false, but he doesn't care. That statement is by David Chandler, who's one of the leading, an American historian, who's one of the leading Cambodia scholars, expressing the consensus of scholarship, supported by U.S. government documents and analysts and so on. And we could go through it point by point in the case of Faurisson and everything else. I'll do it if you like, but I'd rather keep to the topic. Mr. Bolkestein asks whether I still hold that the United States is the torture capital of the free world. Take a look at where it appears. It's in Political Economy of Human Rights, written by Edward Herman and me. We review Amnesty International reports of torture, and we show that according to Amnesty International, most of the torture in the world traces back to Washington support. That's Amnesty International's conclusion. We repeat it. And so it goes point by point. Let me now turn to the serious issues. Mr. Bolkestein says that he's quite right when he says you can't just pick examples. You have to do them in a rational way. That's why we compared examples. So, for example, he likes to avoid this. We didn't discuss Cambodia. We compared Cambodia with East Timor, two very closely paired examples. Two major atrocities, comparable evidence, same scale, same part of the world, evidence at least as adequate in the case of Timor as in Cambodia, and we gave approximately 300 pages of detail covering this in Political Economy of Human Rights, including a reference to every article we could discover about Cambodia and every article we could discover about East Timor. The second was quite easy, because as the atrocities mounted, the coverage dropped, reaching zero as the atrocities reached their peak and American support increased. Now, notice the issue. The atrocities in East Timor could continue because the United States was increasing the flow of arms to Indonesia. As the arms increased, the coverage decreased. Take Cambodia. There's an apparent difference of opinion on the conclusions because they were looking at different facts. The total number of articles we listed, in fact. You don't have to go to his sources because we listed them. There weren't many articles because there was virtually no evidence. But in 1975, 3 weeks after the Khmer Rouge took power, the New York Times accused them of genocide. At that point, there were a few hundred, maybe a few thousand killed. Within a year, they had been accused of genocide in the Reader's Digest, in massive article, a lead article in the Reader's Digest, readership 50 million. TV Guide, second largest journal, readership 20 million. The New York Review of Books for the intellectuals accused them of auto-genocide on the basis of totally falsified evidence, as the author quietly conceded. We go through a case after case, and what we show is massive outrage. There was some evidence suppressed. In fact, what was suppressed was the evidence from the only source that had any information, namely U.S. intelligence. It was suppressed because the figures weren't high enough. We demonstrate a record of deceit which would have impressed Stalin. If you don't believe it, take a look at the documentation. The comparison is to East Timor, where we could have stopped it, remember, because we were increasing the armaments as the comparable atrocities increased. That's what's called serious analysis, not picking examples out of a hat. Of the other examples that Mr. Bolkestein studies, I'm surprised at the choice, because many of them are examples we discussed. For example, Burundi was an example we discussed as demonstrating our model. There were no U.S. elite interests involved. It was therefore not mentioned. As to Watergate, of course we discussed Watergate and we again did a comparison. History arranged a beautiful paired controlled experiment for us at that time. The Watergate exposures appeared precisely at the moment that the FBI Cointelpro operations appeared. These were efforts by the National Political Police to stir up violence in the ghetto. They included political assassination and so on. One of the minor parts of the Cointelpro was the revelation that for 15 years the FBI had been burglarizing the offices of a legal political party, a small legal political party, the Socialist Workers' Party, stealing its records, using them to defame members and put the party out of existence. Now, what was Watergate? Watergate wasn't a fraction of that footnote. Watergate was a break-in into the Democratic Party headquarters by a group of crooks for no known reason. The one that was revealed at the same time was the effort through 3 administrations by the National Political Police to destroy a legal political party. And recall, that was a footnote to Cointelpro.
May I please interrupt you?
Yes.
According to the schedule, you have now 7.5 minutes with interruptions, possible interruptions, which in principle still means that only one person is speaking at the same time.
Who is going on?
You, please, for 7.5
I am
minutes.
going on, or I don't understand this interruptions business. You'll have to explain it to me. I know how to talk and I know how to listen, but I don't know how to interrupt. So.
If Mr. Bolkestein wants to come in, he is allowed to.
Now, who's talking? Who is supposed to be talking?
You.
I talk. He interrupts.
You are talking.
Okay, that's fine. Then let me then finish the thought about Watergate. Why was Watergate a huge issue, and the break-in of the Socialist Workers' Party a zero issue, and the FBI operations to foment violence in the ghetto, of which they were very proud, etc., also a zero issue? Answer very simple. The Democratic Party represents established power. In fact, it represents half of the business power in the United States. Powerful people know how to defend themselves when they're attacked. The issue in Watergate was very simple. People with power will defend themselves. People without power can't. That's the total issue in Watergate. Well, let me go on. Let's take the case of Israel. Mr. Bolkestein says that there was a charge that 600,000 people were displaced in an area with 500,000 people. According to the Israeli government, there are 1 million people living in that area. That's been repeated in article after article in the Hebrew press. You can look at my books for documentation. As for the 600,000, that was given by the Red Cross, reduced by the Red Cross to 300,000, at which point the media repeated the 300,000. The invasion of Lebanon which was supported by the United States officially. The United States kept providing arms, vetoing resolutions at the UN to stop the slaughter and so on. The New York Times described it as the liberation of Lebanon. Lebanese opinion was totally excluded. The Democrats supported it even more than the Republicans, I should say. All of this is documented in my book, to which it described. According to the Lebanese police and the Lebanese government, which Israel installed, there were 20,000 people killed. The Israeli press, which I review in detail, gave much harsher analyses than the American press did. As for Beitar being a fascist-style organization, of course I said it. I was quoting David Ben-Gurion, and I also gave his evidence for it, quoting Beitar documents, which describe it as a fascist organization. As for the, let me go on with the, let's take the Hue massacre. That's, so notice the way Mr. Bolkestein describes it, the way he describes Cambodia, avoiding the paired example, right? Which is why we brought it up, of course. There were 2 Hue massacres. We also discussed that in our book. According to Western sources, about 4,000 people were killed in the U.S. bombing of Hue as they attempted to reconquer the city from the Viet Cong, who he failed to tell us are South Vietnamese. According to the same U.S. government sources, 2,800 people were killed by the communists during the reconquest, the U.S. reconquest of Hue. So there are 2 Hue massacres. Notice the one that the press focused on and that he repeats.
Chairman, may I come in on this point? The reason that I raised the matter of the Hue massacre was not in order to prove or to say that either one side or the other had perpetrated this massacre. It was merely to ask the question why Miss McCarthy preferred to think that her own country
massacre. The one that's described in the press and referred to in history is the alleged communist massacre, which, according to careful analysts afterwards, did involve maybe 700 or 1,000 people during the U.S. reconquest of the city that was reconquered from South Vietnamese, may I remind you.
Mr. Chairman, may I put another question on Indochina to Professor Chomsky? Chairman, the first book, the first serious book that came out on the Cambodian genocide was a book written by a Frenchman, François Ponchot. It is called Cambodge Année Zéro. Professor Chomsky leaves no opportunity unused in order to cast doubts on the veracity of that book. My question to him is, why does he do that?
Let me explain. You can find this, it's all in print. You can also find Mr. Ponchot, Reverend Ponchot's priest, response to what we wrote. For example, if you look at the introduction to this is a French book. I wrote the first review of it in the United States when it was still unavailable. We couldn't even find it in the country. Edward Herman and I, we praised the book as serious and worth reading, with its description of the brutal practices of the Khmer Rouge and their grisly atrocities as recounted by refugees. In the American edition, not the English edition, notice, in the American, I'll explain the difference. The difference is explained in detail in Political Economy of Human Rights, and is one of these examples of extraordinary deceit that I described. In the American edition of his book, which appeared in 1979, so after late 1978, Father Ponchot thanked in his preface, the author's prefatory remarks, thanked me for having praised his book, and in turn praised me for what he called the responsible and serious attitude I had taken towards Cambodia, referring to everything I had written on the subject, including even private letters. Now, those phrases were withdrawn from the British edition of the book, the World edition, which you will now hear, and replaced by what he knew to be flat lies, because he assumed that the British edition would never be seen in the United States where it's not commercially available, and that he had accused the United States of having killed 200,000 people in the bombing, where the evidence showed that 200,000 people were wounded in the bombing. It was quite a difference. And we said this seemed inaccurate. Now, it was very striking, and in fact, that was correct too. In short, we were committed to finding out the truth. When he exaggerated the scale of American crimes, we raised a question about it. When he invented quotations, as he later conceded, we questioned that on the basis of the conflicting evidence. That's the way you're supposed to write a review. You're supposed to look for what looks plausible in the book, look for what looks questionable, ask about it. In fact, it turns out that in the case of every question we raised about the review, about the book, he himself conceded that either it was fabricated or there was no evidence. But I repeat, we praised the book, and in the American edition, though not the British edition, he thanked us for that praise. The author's prefaces are identical except for that sentence.
Chairman, may I?
Yes.
May I say?
You, excuse me. It's now time for your 7.5 minutes. And so you are allowed to interrupt if you want to.
Probably won't.
Chairman, I merely wanted to remark that Professor Chomsky writes in his latest book called Manufacturing Consent on page 383 that François Ponchot is a highly dubious source.
That's right. A person who does what I just described and who falsifies facts, who not only falsifies facts but also lies outright in the fact that I just described, I would say he's a dubious source. But we still say the book is serious and worth reading, despite the fact that he's a very dubious source.
Chairman, Professor Chomsky loses no opportunity to cast doubts on the scale of the atrocities that took place in Cambodia. And it is a pity that a man of his...
Could you give an example of that?
The one I've just given now.
What did you just give? You said that I regard him as a dubious source because, for example, in a British, he publishes 2 books at the same time which are identical, except the one for the American market praises me for the responsible attitude and precision of thought that I've shown, and the World edition, which is not available in the United States, removes that sentence, came out dated the same day, incidentally, removes that sentence and claims that I attacked him. And it claims, in fact, what Mr. Bolkestein is saying. Well, yes, that makes him a dubious source. Does that have anything to do with misestimating the scale of the massacres? No. If you take a look at our book, you'll notice that every existing estimate was given, from the smallest in the Far Eastern Economic Review to the largest, the one that was invented by Jean Lacouture and which he later conceded he had invented. We give them all, and we end up saying, we do not know where the truth lies amid this, this vast difference. We tentatively assume that U.S. intelligence is probably correct. That's the one limited commitment we make. There was no evidence at the time. And in fact, existing scholarship concludes that U.S. intelligence was in fact correct. I should say, if you're interested in the record of scholarship, there's one major scholarly book, Michael Vickery's book, Cambodia, in which he points out, 5 years after our book appeared, that despite the huge flow of evidence that appeared since, there is virtually nothing in our book that would have to be modified in any way. There's a reason for that. Our chapter on Cambodia was read by virtually every major scholar in the field. And in fact, any possible errors would have been filtered out. That's why no one's ever found any.
Thank you, Mr. Bolkestein.
Mr. Chairman.
Notice I don't like to interrupt.
Mr. Chairman, I want to repeat that Professor Chomsky has left no opportunity unused to throw doubts on the reports of what went on in Cambodia.
Can you give an example?
Yes, your article in The Nation of 1977. It's an article of around 6 pages, which is suffused with doubts about the reports that came out of Cambodia.
Can you give one example? Can you give one example?
I've quoted it.
No, you didn't. You
yes,
said that years later. You said that 10 years later, after all that I've described, I indicated that Ponchot is a dubious source for very ample reasons.
And I also repeat that what you said in 1977 amounts to throwing. Yes,
give me an example.
I'm giving it. The whole article.
Well, you said there's an article, but you haven't given me an example.
Chairman, in that article, he quotes approvingly the opinion of somebody who says that the victims in Cambodia amount to at most a few 10,000.
That was American intelligence.
Yes, and you quote it approvingly.
Yes, I approvingly report. First of all, it's not approving. Among the various estimates we give, some lower, incidentally, and some much higher, we included the estimate that at the time was being given by U.S. intelligence. We didn't say much about it. It later turned out to be quite accurate.
Well, Chairman, may I wind up this point by saying that I think it's a pity that a person with the stature of Professor Chomsky has spent the years that the Holocaust in Cambodia took place nitpicking about refugee reports rather than lending the considerable stature.
Could you give an example where we nitpick about refugee reports?
Rather than lending his considerable stature and influence to a campaign to get the Cambodian government to trial. The Nazis were brought to trial in Nuremberg. The Japanese were brought to trial in Tokyo. Those trials were perhaps were not perfect, but at least the trials took place. The perpetrators of the massacres in Cambodia have never been brought to any trial. I wish Professor Chomsky, instead of nitpicking about refugee reports, would have lent the force of his...
Could you give an example of nitpicking about refugee reports?
Would have lent
Can you give one example?
Yes, the article you wrote in 1977.
The only thing we do there is quote Father Ponchot on the care that must be taken with refugee reports. He's the one who was nitpicking. No. We didn't. Well, give an example.
You review a couple of books. You review the book of Barrett and Paul on the Cambodia massacre, and you devalue the book completely.
Yes, it was also dismissed out of hand by William Shawcross, and Michael Vickery, the one scholar who's written about it, showed that his figures were simply given by the CIA. In fact, nobody takes it seriously. The book we took seriously was François Ponchot's, correctly. But notice what is missing in this discussion. Please. Notice that you haven't heard one word about East Timor.
Professor Chomsky.
That's the massacre that we carried out and that we refused to discuss. And that is precisely what's typical. Remember, we spent several hundred pages comparing
Mr. Chomsky,
examples on the coverage of it.
May I remind you that it was you who was interrupting, and Mr. Bolkestein. Please. So you've got 2 minutes left. You wanted 2 minutes?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, I should like to use those few minutes in order to say something about the sources that Professor Chomsky uses. Professor Chomsky excoriates the free press, but where it suits his arguments, he quotes it extensively. Where did he learn about the atrocities in East Timor or in Central America, if not in the same free press which he so derides? Similarly with the American government. In his view, it is but a tool of the American elite, but of the State Department's Cambodia specialists. He writes, and he is repeated today, that their testimony proves accurate in retrospect. Professor Chomsky praises Rod Nordland as a respected Newsweek journalist. He quotes Nordland approvingly when this journalist describes the behavior of Sandinista troops. But Professor Chomsky changes his tune when Nordland writes, quote, critics like Noam Chomsky have sought, with rhetorical gymnastics, but little or no first-hand experience, to downplay the Cambodian horror as nothing but a war-induced famine exaggerated by a biased Western press and wild-eyed refugees. Then Professor Chomsky accuses Nordland of repeating gossip. The French journalist Jean Lacouture, also mentioned tonight by Professor Chomsky, was for 20 years a supporter of the Vietnamese communists. He wrote a biography of Ho Chi Minh. He was then a great pal of Professor Chomsky. Around 1977, Lacouture changed his mind about what went on in Indochina. Now Professor Chomsky engages in bitter polemics with him. And so it is with the Australian scholar Ben-Gurion, who has admitted to being wrong on Pol Pot. Professor Chomsky only quotes where it suits him. Now, the New York Times wrote recently that since 1950, China has shown Tibet the rawest face of imperialism, and this has resulted in the death of perhaps 1 million Tibetans. It's an item in the New York Times. What are we to do with that item? Can Professor Chomsky tell us what we are to make of it? Is the New York Times again pulling the wool over our eyes? Or if not, is Washington still the murder and torture capital of the world?
Professor Chomsky, your final remarks, please.
I actually intended to talk about the topic, but I see with Mr. Bolkestein talking about the topic is impossible. You'll notice he's doing everything possible to avoid the topic and talking about my alleged sins, which are irrelevant. He asked where I learned, he claims that I quoted selectively and asked where I learned about the atrocities in East Timor and Central America, namely from the American press. Well, certainly it wasn't from the American press for the simple reason that in the case of East Timor there were no articles except for a few apologetic comments saying that nothing has happened. I learned about them, you can find out where I learned about them by looking at my footnotes. I learned about them from human rights reports, from church reports, from refugee studies, and extensively from the Australian press. There was nothing from the American press because it was silenced. He asked where I learned about the atrocities in Central America. Take a look at the footnotes. It was from human rights reports, from independent investigators, from the British Parliamentary Human Rights Commission, from a massive documentation, most of which was suppressed because the United States the press was repressing it. He claims that I quote selectively from Mr. Nordland, but without giving you the background. Why did Nordland come up? Well, the reason is in one of his innumerable falsifications, which I documented in NRC Handelsblad, Mr. Bolkestein claimed that I had said that I had praised Sandinista troops and quoted a few remarks. As I pointed out in response, I hadn't praised Sandinista troops at all. I had quoted Rod Nordland, who did a Newsweek reporter, did a cover story for Newsweek, in which he went through Central America, he went through Nicaragua first with Contras, then with Sandinista troops, and gave his reaction. I quoted it. He's a perfectly good reporter. I'll quote any good reporter on anything. Why do I treat it differently when he accuses me of falsifying things about the Khmer Rouge? Because he has no idea what I wrote about the Khmer Rouge. That is gossip. The first was his direct reporting. The second was the gossip. There has, of course, been a major slander campaign. Many people are very irritated by the fact that we exposed the extraordinary deceit over Cambodia and paired it with the simultaneous suppression of the US-supported ongoing atrocities in Timor. People don't like that. For one thing, we were challenging the right to lie in defense of the state. For another thing, we were exposing the apologetics and support for actual ongoing atrocities. That doesn't make you popular. You do that kind of thing, you'll be subjected to the sort of business you've heard here. And Rod Nordland was quoting it. Now, there's a big difference between his investigative reporting and his picking up gossip on the grapevine. There was which Mr. Bolkestein did not describe. There happened to be a letter by Edward Herman responding to Nordland and showing why what he wrote was false, to which there was no response. Now, I won't go on about this. I haven't had time. It takes a half a minute to produce a falsehood. It takes a long discussion to show why it's false. As a result, I've only sampled the cases. Let me remind you, for example, just to take one again of the Tet Offensive, recall that it was the CIA and US military intelligence and the president's political advisors who gave an appraisal far more grim than that of the media, which was relatively upbeat. To believe that President Johnson resigned because of what he read in the New York Times when he was reading harsher criticisms from intelligence reports, that takes a curious view of the world. Let me finally say one word about the actual topic, which I'm sorry we have not been able to discuss because of these efforts to evade it. Those who believe there has been a major commitment to manipulation, deceit, and manufacture of consent. I gave you a few examples. There are many more in print. It's a standard theme. There has been extensive and detailed documented study of the media, which documents these facts. You can look it up. Those who believe in democracy and freedom have a serious task ahead of them. What they should be doing, in my view, is dedicating their efforts to helping the despised common people to struggle for their rights and to realize the democratic goals that constantly surface throughout history. They should be serving not power and privilege, but rather their victims. And for reasons that I mentioned and had wished that there had been time to describe, freedom and democracy are by now not merely values to be treasured, they are quite possibly the prerequisite to survival.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me on your behalf thank both Professor Chomsky and Mr. Bolkestein for their contributions. I shall not try to summarize the discussion because later on... I'm sorry that it was, the last one was Professor Chomsky. You agreed to that? Yes, it was. BC, dat is overgelopen. No, I'm sorry, it was... I've timed it on my chess clock and Professor Chomsky had about 2 minutes more, which I think is for someone who comes from the United States quite reasonable. I shall not try to summarize the discussion. I think that many subjects have been untouched. For example, why the press is really allowing to be suppressed and used, and the mechanisms that are in work, the 5 filters of Professor Chomsky. Unfortunately, I think that what I said in the beginning, I have no illusion that they will agree on the evidence this evening has become true. One thing is sure, their consent has not been manufactured tonight. Nevertheless, I thank warmly both speakers of tonight. And you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a tea break of 15 minutes.
One of which supports power, one is against power, and you ask how they're covered. Well, let's take Watergate. In the case of Watergate, and we have two. Watergate is perfect because history set up a controlled experiment for us. Two things came out exactly at the same time. One was the fact that American power was attacked, business power was attacked. That's the Democratic Party. That represents half, approximately, of establishment power. They were attacked in a very minor way, extremely minor. A gang of Keystone crooks, entered the Democratic Party headquarters for no known reason and did nothing. That was Watergate. At the very same time, there were revelations that included the following. One, a legal political party had been attacked by the National Political Police for well over a decade. Its files robbed. It's leaked to potential employers to prevent them from being employed in order to destroy this legal political party. Well, what's the difference between that? Notice that that one example is far more significant than all of Watergate. But there were no proceedings about it. It was never discussed. And let me add that that was a footnote. That was in addition to a whole mass of other revelations, also not discussed. Well, what that tells you is, think it through. What it tells you is powerful people can defend themselves. That illustrates our thesis. Powerful people will defend themselves.
Yeah, but
we're not going to repeat exchanges. Is that okay?
Let me just continue.
Can you move on a little?
If you will allow me one question.
Yes.
Watergate happened immediately after a landslide victory for Nixon. So supposedly Nixon was quite significantly more powerful than the Democrats.
See, that is a misunderstanding. You don't understand American politics. American politics involves two factions of the business party. There are two factions of the business party. It's been going on for a long time. They're each very powerful. Each of them represents extensive established power, and they do not like to be attacked. They will defend themselves if they're attacked. The Socialist Workers' Party is just as much a legal political party as the Democratic Party, but it has no power. So therefore, when it is far more ferociously attacked, that's not an issue. And recall that that was only one thing that came out. The other thing that came out was that the National Political Police had been carrying out illegal operations to undermine the black movements, the peace movement, the women's movement, the American Indian movement, and so on, and in fact doing it by fomenting violence in the ghettos, by fomenting race wars, in fact, which they took credit for. It involved the assassination of a political organizer with FBI complicity. All of this came out at the same time. It was never discussed. What was discussed was that the Democratic Party, which represents political power, was under attack, period. Dramatic illustration of our thesis. If anybody can find a counterexample, I'll be glad to look at it. The other question was what I do about cases where the ruling class acts foolishly. Answer, I do nothing about it because it's irrelevant to the issue. I'm not claiming that people always make the right decisions. It's not a discussion. The question is, how do the media react to these cases, to what happens? Well, I've illustrated that. There's another logical error that ought to be clarified. It came up a number of times. The question of attempt to manipulate and success in manipulation are two different things, radically different. Several people mentioned, they said, well, we don't think the population is always manipulated. I fully agree. In fact, I've discussed this at great length, but it's totally irrelevant. Suppose I was studying, we can tend to be able to think more easily about our enemies, so let's pick one just to clarify the error. Suppose I'm studying Pravda, okay? What I would conclude is, I'm sure, I haven't studied it, but I'm sure I would conclude that it's an instrument of the Ministry of Truth, which tries to control thought in the interests of established power. That's what I would conclude. I suppose somebody came out and said, look at all the people who don't agree with what they read there, which is probably the majority of the population. I suspect that an average sensible Russian, when they pick up Pravda, figure out the opposite's true. Does that show that Pravda is not acting in the way I described? Of course not. It's just a logical error. Attempt to manipulate and success in manipulation are two radically different things. And in fact, see, if you really look, again, I've discussed this in some detail, but what you typically find is that among the educated classes, you get a large measure of success in manipulation. Among the unwashed masses, you very often don't. And you see evidence of that. For example, why does the state resort to, why is manufacture of consent carried out? Why don't you just tell the truth? Well, you don't trust the people. That's why. It's easier to tell the truth. Why does the state resort to clandestine operations? They're very inefficient. Direct aggression is much easier. Clandestine operations are a pretty good measure of domestic dissidence. That's why in the 1980s there was such a massive resort to clandestine operations. The effort to manipulate the general public wasn't working, though the manipulation of the elites worked fantastically, as demonstrated by the coverage of the main issue, Central America. Same was true of Vietnam. This has to do with Eric's point about the values, common values. Sure, there are common values. For example, people are opposed to aggression, massacre, and slaughter. That's why the fact that we're engaged in aggression, massacre, and slaughter has to be suppressed. Notice the way we've suppressed it tonight. One issue came up, Cambodia. There were actually 2 slaughters in Cambodia. There's one government study, the Finnish government did a governmental study of Cambodia. The only reference I've ever seen to it in the United States is my own. It's the one official governmental study of what happened. It's titled The Decade of the Genocide. The reason it's titled The Decade of the Genocide is because there was a slaughter in the first half of the decade, mainly American bombing, and there was a slaughter in the second half of the decade, namely Pol Pot. As far as we know, they're probably roughly comparable in scale. And notice the one we discussed. In our recent book, we actually describe in some detail the American coverage of that. The first one, not only was it not, there were about 1 million refugees flooding into Phnom Penh when the countryside was being subjected to the heaviest bombing in history. Press was there. Sidney Schanberg, the conscience of the media, was the New York Times correspondent there. We go through all the coverage during the period, and you could have learned a lot about what's happening just by asking. You don't have to go out into the bush. You could cross the street and talk to the refugees. There's a few scattered phrases in dozens and dozens of articles. Nobody wanted to know what was going on. So we know very little, in fact, about what was happening in the first half of the decade of the genocide. What we talk about is the second half. Notice there's another point. Let me repeat it again. When we discussed Cambodia, we discussed it in a context because we're trying to carry out appropriate methodology. We asked how the West reacted to the Pol Pot slaughters and how they reacted to the slaughters that the West was carrying out at the same time. Recall that East Timor, where the evidence was comparable, the slaughters were comparable in scale, actually greater relative to the population at the time we wrote, and probably later. That was carried out because the United States was supporting it, Holland too. It could have been stopped. The United States actually escalated the flow of arms in 1978. The Carter administration sharply increased the flow of arms in 1978 because the Indonesian government was actually running out of arms. There were 90% American arms. So it was easy to stop, stop sending them arms, stop giving them diplomatic support. Coverage went to 0, and I noticed with some interest that nobody seems to be interested in this. Although Holland was sending tanks, corvettes, and so on, and of course giving diplomatic support throughout this whole period. That's interesting. There were 2 slaughters, roughly comparable, one which we were engaged in and could have stopped, the other one which the enemy was engaged in, and nobody ever had a proposal as to how to stop it. And you'll notice which one we talked about. That tells you something about shared values. If you tell the common people you're involved in a slaughter of the style of Pol Pot, there'll be a reaction. That's why it's not talked about. The same is true in Central America in the 1980s. There are approximately 200,000 people who have been slaughtered in Central America. Slaughtered, I mean. And I mean mutilated, tortured, piles of bones and so on. Well, we did it, We kept doing it. The press continued to say we should continue to do it because we should support those states, El Salvador and Guatemala.
May I interrupt you at this point? Because, well, the choreography, it seems like the choreography of this session changes under my hands, sort of. Sure, of course.
The point was made that the press, the left-wing intellectuals controlled the press in the 1960s. Well, again, I only study the United States. I'd like to hear an example.
Okay. Well, that's. I was going to say that this is not meant as an interrogation
my
of
point. That was said.
Yes, please.
Exactly it.
Go ahead,
sure,
please.
Yes, it was all over the place.
Give me an example.
Here, this man knows all about it. Our commissioner for the Queen. He told me so many times that time. Yeah, yeah. Okay, you know nothing about Dutch politics.
I will only tell you that, to my knowledge, there is one study of the European press is rarely studied. People have impressions. There's one study that I know of. It's by somebody who's here, in fact, a thesis at Nijmegen, comparing the European coverage of the Nicaraguan and Salvadoran elections. And it is radically different. A totally different agenda was used in the Nicaraguan elections and the Salvadoran elections. In the Salvadoran elections, issues were selected which would make them look good, and issues that would make them look bad were suppressed. In the Nicaraguan elections, the agenda was shifted. That's the only study that exists. If you want to check further, please do. But check on the but make statements on the basis of evidence, not impressions.
Would you care to comment?
Mr. Chairman, perhaps I may add a few comments to the remarks that Mr. Chomsky just now made. His theory is a theory that he claims to establish by means of examples. And therefore, the only recourse I can have is to mention examples that don't fit his theory. And that is what I try to do. Now, of course, it's difficult to prove a theory merely by examples, as I said during my introduction. But because he eschews a logical proof of the theory that he has posited, there's nothing else for me to do except mention counterexamples. Now, the trouble about the difficulty of the debates between Professor Chomsky and myself is that not only do we disagree on an interpretation of the facts, but we disagree on the facts themselves. And of course, in a debate like this, it is very difficult to establish facts because one has to have recourse to handbooks or newspapers or other indexed information in order to prove one's point. But I think that a number of examples that I made are sufficiently clear and I think are well known to a number of people in this hall for them to be cogent examples that go against the whole train of thoughts that Professor Chomsky has tonight outlined. I've mentioned the example of Steve Biko. It doesn't fit his theory. I've mentioned the example of Tet. He disagrees with me, but I still maintain that the way that Tet was reported in the American press did not serve the ends of the American government or of the American elite, whoever they may be. I gave the example of the Lebanon. The reportage of Israeli incursion into the Lebanon was extremely biased. It was a trend that was followed by a whole slew of reporters, and it was an anti-Israeli trend that did not serve the purpose of the Israeli government nor of the American government, who Professor Chomsky claims is the Israeli paymaster. Then there was the example of Nicaragua, and there is another example of Grenada. The American media did not at all take a negative attitude towards the Sandinista revolution. On the contrary, they welcomed it, and President Carter, as I said, extended a loan of $60 million to the Sandinista. Why would he do a thing like that if the American government and the American media behave according to the theory of Professor Chomsky? In the case of Grenada, there was a news blackout. It was instituted by the American government for 48 hours. For 48 hours, there was a news blackout surrounding the American invasion of Grenada, the intervention of Grenada. I'm not here concerned with the question whether that invasion, that intervention was good or not. I'm merely concerned with the question, how did the American press react to the American intervention in Grenada, and in particular to the news blackout in Grenada? They stood on their hind legs. They said, if the press aren't there, the people aren't there. In other words, they protested in the most vociferous and strongly voiced words, and therefore this is another example that does not fit Professor Chomsky's thesis. The Pentagon Papers have been mentioned tonight. The man who has been accused of leaking the Pentagon Papers to the press is Daniel Ellsberg. Criminal proceedings were started against Daniel Ellsberg. What happened to him? He was acquitted. Now, if the American elite have such a hold on the American media, how could all this have happened? The truth of the matter is that Professor Chomsky holds to a conspiracy theory which is not borne out by the facts. He looks back in anger at his own society. He says that the American sphere of influence is determined by the sale of arms. Now, that is not true. Take the Argentine. He claims that the United States are responsible or co-responsible for the repression in the Argentine because arms were sold to the Argentine government. Now, did the Argentine government do the bidding of their supposed masters in Washington? Look at the grain embargo of the Soviet Union. Reagan wanted to institute a wheat embargo against the Soviet Union. They needed the cooperation of the Argentine. Did they get it? Hell no, they didn't get it. Now, what sort of influence is that? So what I mean to say by these examples is that they do not fit the theory of Professor Chomsky. And he, in his misguided enthusiasm, exceeds all bounds. He told Le Monde in an article that was published in 1979 that the whole Gulag, that all the news about the Gulag came out in the Western press to coincide with the American retreat from Vietnam. Now, how am I to understand this? That Solzhenitsyn wrote the books exactly on command by the American elite to coincide with the American retreat from Vietnam. His implication is that the whole story of the Gulag in Russia was engineered to break at that precise moment in 1975 to deflect attention from the American withdrawal from Vietnam. And he says, if the atrocities exist, so much the better. I'm quoting his words. So much the better. If they don't exist, well then they are invented. So atrocities are invented to deflect attention from the doings of the American government. It's a conspiracy theory, pure and simple. It is not borne out by the facts. Mr. Chairman, I have to go to Amsterdam. If you'll excuse me, I'm leaving.
At any rate,
I'll have to request a privilege. You'll notice the asymmetry continues.
Just a second, please.
I discuss the issue. Mr. Bolkestein makes up stories about me. May I run through the stories? They're false in every case.
No, you may not
I
at this time.
I will simply state that they are false in every case. If anybody wants to know them, I'll be glad to.
But I'm sorry, but I have an idea that we're going through a repetition of moves, and I think that we have that at this point we thank Mr. Bolkestein for his contribution tonight and wish him a good trip back. Thank you.